Okay, people, and we are back and live. I would now like to take this minute to introduce Dr. M. Zhudi Jasser. For those of you who don't know who he is, or who do know who he is and want to follow him on Twitter, you can find him using the @name @Dr. Zhudi Jasser. Now, he also does a show called Reform. He's a podcast host of the Blaze Radio Network. He's the president of the American Islamic Forum for Democracy, co-founder of Muslim Reform Movement, former U.S. Navy Lieutenant Commander, and author of A Battle for Soul of Islam. And that's what I was just saying to Dr. Jasser here. That's quite some lengthy. That's a lot of things to be involved with. Where do you start, and where would you like to start?
Well, I think, it's we have, since the Arab awakening now, people have become awakened to what many of us Muslims have been dealing with for our entire lives. And in my book, Battle for the Soul of Islam, I talk about this struggle within, which is something I've been dealing with since, I grew up in a small town in Wisconsin, was on a Navy scholarship through medical school. And my parents escaped Syria in the mid-'60s. I was born in the U.S. and was raised to believe that I could practice my faith more freely in the West and in the Midwest of the United States than I could anywhere else in the world. And ultimately, it developed an intense nationalism, patriotism within myself, and an understanding of what it meant to be American. And there was only one thing I would ever die for, and that is America. And for that reason, I joined the U.S. Navy. Even though I love my faith and I have a close relationship with God, I've been a part of building over 4 mosques in the United States, I would never die for Islam. Islam, to me, is not a political movement. It shouldn't be. And I was naive before I went to the University of Wisconsin, thinking that Islam was just a personal faith. And then I went to the university, and in my book, I talk about how I started to have some interactions with the Muslim Student Association and other Islamic organizations, and realized that they weren't just about spirituality, they were about a global political movement, and that they were offshoots of the Muslim Brotherhood movements. And long story short, I started to read up and learn about Hassan al-Banna and the Muslim Brotherhood movement, political Islam, and then I joined the military and sort of put my activism on hold for a while. After 9/11, many of us realized that Al-Qaeda was simply a symptom of a deeper problem, which is this supremacism of political Islam and all Islamic states, and the OIC, if you will, and we can talk about what that is. But the bottom line is our organization we formed in 2003 called the American Islamic Forum for Democracy. It's formed by Muslims who believe that terrorism is simply a symptom, and that our mission statement is to protect the U.S. Constitution, liberty, and freedom through the separation of mosque and state, and that separation is the only way to relegate the Islamists to the universities, to the mosques, and have Islam begin to go through what Christianity went through in the Enlightenment and the Renaissance, and then ultimately in the revolutions that created the free West, which is the French Revolution, the American Revolution, and the defeat of theocracy. And that's really where we think we are. Our organization, and then our reform movement that has since formed since just last year, is a group of organizations that believes that we are now battling against theocracy globally.
So, in your opinion, because obviously your knowledge of Islam is something that is far greater than mine, but I do think that non-Muslims are educating themselves on Islam. And I think that that's become where there is this, there's become almost a them and us type mentality. And something that I've been trying to get people to understand is that if we have a them and us mentality, we're going to end up with a civil war without a doubt. Absolutely without a doubt, that will happen. When you've got reformers such as yourself and Rahil Raza and Shireen Kadozi, these are the people we should be giving a voice to, who actually get very little airtime on actual TV. So the major TV network stations don't really give people like yourself or Rahil good, decent airtime. But they will give airtime to those who we then find out have links to extremism. So from a non-Muslim perspective, as a Muslim yourself, do you understand why non-Muslims are as enraged as they are?
Oh, absolutely. And that's why I've taken the time from my medical practice, from my family to do this is, I'm not doing this because I particularly want to save Islam. To me, I do this because I'm worried about the security of the West. I think that the West is in a profound security threat right now, and that threat is related to 70% of the world that's under some form of oppression. If it's not Russia or China, the rest of the world is under oppressive Islamic regimes. And they basically look upon the West as their biggest threat because we're about liberty and freedom. And I don't blame the West for being afraid. The problem is that the West needs to, and far be it from me to tell the West what to do, but as a Westerner and as an American, I believe that we need to, if we overshoot and say that all Islam is the problem, that all Muslims are the problem, then you're going to either have to declare war on a quarter of the world's population, or you're going to have to convert a quarter of the world's population to some other faith other than Islam, and that just is not possible. It's going to basically devolve into a clash of civilizations. Second strategy is appeasement. Appeasement hasn't worked. I think President Obama's administration has shown that a withdrawal from Iraq and from the Middle East has actually empowered the Islamists to fill vacuums, and that the opportunity of the Arab awakening, which I think was one of the first solutions, because you can't reform Islam without the laboratories of freedom and democracy that we have in the West. And in the Middle East, the dictators, the military generals, the royal families, the monarchs, the autocrats, the kleptocrats have environments in which they don't want Islam to be reformed. They prefer it, as Marx called it, religion, the opium of the masses. They prefer religion to be a tool that they use in their own Sharia states. And the only difference between the Muslim Brotherhood and al-Sisi, or the Wahhabis and the Saudi royal family, is the royal family is an oligarch and an oligarchical Sharia state, versus the Wahhabi grassroots movement or the Muslim Brotherhood movement is a viral Islamic state. But they both use Sharia. They drink from the same supremacist trough. So as the West looks at solutions, the reason we haven't gotten the time on air is, remember, the petro-Islam has dominated the lobby groups, the media, the universities, the political establishment, etc. So as a result, most of the identity movements of Islam are Islamists by definition. Those of us who are Americans that happen to be Muslim, or British that happen to be Muslim, are not going to be going around being politically active because of our Islamic identity. While Islamists that are Muslims that are Islamists are going to be organizing in a theocratic mindset because their political identity is tied to their Muslim identity. The second thing that marginalizes reformist voices is the fact that in the West, the axis of politics, the axis of public discourse revolves around right and left. So whatever way we can use the Muslim minority, be it the right or the left, they will use it. So the left uses it as an identity minority politic, that they stand against the victimization of Muslims. They stand for anything that prevents the decrease of human rights for Muslims, etc. But they never hold Muslims accountable to those issues within their communities. The right is the security response, saying that we will protect the West from the threat of Muslims, so all Muslims are possible terrorists. Both are wrong. And in the middle is sort of the rest of the population who's confused. So when you have a mayor that gets elected in London, you basically realize that, if anything, Muslims should realize that there is little discrimination. How else could he be elected mayor? But yet the mayor himself ignored most of the internal reforms necessary for women's rights, against Sharia law, against all these things that are problematic within Muslim communities, because the political divide left to right was that he was standing for minority rights, against the right, xenophobia, etc. And that axis makes Muslims be used as a ping pong ball from left to right, rather than a reality of, well, what can the Muslim population internally in this laboratory in Britain or the United States, what can our Muslim population do here that can then translate into changes in Muslim majority countries in Saudi Arabia, Pakistan, Iran, etc. So This is the opportunity, I think, that's been lost so much, is that
I would
we
agree
just
with
look
you.
upon them as a minority. Sorry.
No, I would agree. I would agree with a lot of what you said, but there are other things that people have to. Just as you say that Muslims are caught in the middle like a ping pong ball, so is anybody who is deemed. And people do like to deem anybody with an opinion like mine as being far right. Doesn't matter how many Muslims you try and help or support or what you do. And I do go out of my way, give a lot of support to Muslim women who've suffered Sharia in this country. What we see is a Muslim mayor. Yes, he got elected. However, sadly, he has links to extremism. So when we look at the links of extremism, we as the public are sitting there going, hang on a minute. So we've now got a Muslim mayor, and straight after him we had 5 more Muslim mayors, but we're constantly told that Muslims are disenfranchised, marginalised. These are all the nice big words they like to use so the public feel guilty. They also do prey on this white guilt thing that, we should feel guilty for being white. Well, I didn't choose it. It's not an option. If it had been, I probably wouldn't have chosen blonde hair, but I've got it and that's the way it is. But there is this problem where non-Muslims have not been heard for so long when we called out the issues with regards to Rotherham and the grooming gangs that were happening. And when we said these are Muslim men, we were all of us targeted. These men are not true Muslims. They're not true Muslims. They're not true. Well, they call themselves Muslims. They practice Islam in whatever form they want to practice it in. They are Muslim. You've got good and bad in everything.
Yeah, and I think you hit the nail on the head in that there is no one Islam. This attempt by one side to say Islam is all peaceful is wrong, the other side to say Islam is all war, that's wrong. I think there are many forms of Islam. The question is to hold Muslims accountable, and that's what our Muslim Reform Movement is trying to do, is that we have a declaration, Muslim Reform Movement declaration, that's simply 2 pages, 12 principles that are, if Muslims believe in those things, forget whether Islam is there as a faith. There are a lot of issues that need modernization within the Islamic theology, but the question is that we as Muslims believe that violent jihad should end. It's for the history books, no longer necessary. The Muslim army military, a Muslim military concept should end, no longer necessary. The caliphate, our Muslim Reform Movement abandons the caliphate. We reject any concept of a caliphate. We reject any institutionalized Sharia, meaning that we only believe Sharia should be personal, about dietary, fasting, prayer, personal pietistic Sharia, fine. Sharia means God's law. But in government, in institutions, in public setting, we reject it and we prefer reason-based common law, if you will, as dominating the way the social contract works. We respect the equality of men and women. We reject blasphemy and apostasy laws. We call for the freedom of sexual identity, of any identity, be it national identity, especially taking preeminence over any type of political identity related to our faith. And I think, if I can sort of tap into what's happening in Britain for a second, Brexit, I think, is a major opportunity. And the reason why it's so helpful in this is that the weakness of the EU and why Islamism is probably much bigger threat than it is in America is because in America there is an intense identification of religious freedom with American nationalism. In the EU, with the attempt to dissolve sort of national identity, Islamism filled that vacuum. Brexit, I think, is trying to recover British identity because 81% of Muslims in a study 4 or 5 years ago said they were Muslim first and British second. That is a major problem.
But that is getting worse. And I'll be honest with you, I mean, when it comes to national identity, I myself, and we've had this problem in this country for a long time, I don't recognise myself as being British. I'm English because I was born in England. I wasn't born in Scotland, Ireland or Wales. And a lot of people don't understand that. But the minute you do that, even to call yourself English makes you a racist according to the powers that be. And there is this divide, and it is something I feel, I mean, I'm the founder of Mothers Against Radical Islam and Sharia. And in doing that, I've helped girls that have been groomed by Muslim men, and I've also helped women who suffer because of Sharia law, just as I've helped those who have become apostates, who've chosen to leave Islam, but they have to live a double life in this country. You know, they live in fear. This is a country where your freedom shouldn't come at a price.
Exactly. And these issues that you and I are talking about are not esoteric. They're not nuanced. It's very clear, because if you look at ISIS, the reason ISIS has had the great threat, far greater orders of magnitude than Al-Qaeda's entire mission was certainly radical Islam and Caliphism, but it was all about getting the West out of the Middle East. That was their entire mission. They didn't have a mission of a state, of a legal system, etc. ISIS now has territory, and it has an identity that its jihadists from all over the world want to come and die for that Islamic State to fill in the vacuum that the dictatorships leaving would have. Muslims, until we start to get sort of a handle on what it means, what is national sovereignty, and do we believe in nation states that are based in secular law, or do we want an Islamic State? Because right now, most of the apologists that are doing what's called countering violent extremism are failing miserably, because it's a whack-a-mole program, because all they're doing is saying the extremism is wrong, the terrorism is wrong, the technique is wrong. They're not countering the ends. And right now, the only way I can see to counter-radicalize and make sure my children are not radicalized and other Muslim children are not radicalized is to make them feel that Britain, Belgium, France, America, Canada are countries that they would want to die for, and they would never want to die for any other nation state, especially an Islamic one, because it's a facade. It's a mirage. There is no Islamic State. Sharia is interpretation. It's man-made law. It's not God's law. So all these things need reform, but we have to do it, and this is why Muslims need to do it, is it has to be done from a position of love, and that I do it from tough love, meaning that I love my faith, but yet we need to call out Muslims and make them uncomfortable about their silence, because it's no different than the Germans who were silent under the Nazis. They were basically acquiescing to what the Nazis were doing to the Jews through their silence. And I think similarly, Muslims, our legacy cannot be that we sat silent in the lap of freedom in Britain or any other country while radical Islam was spreading its civilizational jihad on the West. And our documentary, A Third Jihad, back from 2009, talks about what the program is for radical Islam and political Islam, non-violent. And that's why our strategy should be to counter violent Islamism, not violent extremism, but violent Islamism. And, you know, as much as, you know, Prime Minister Cameron, it was, you know, fine he had to leave because of Brexit, he was one of the clearest leaders about naming Islamism and working with counter-Islamist groups rather than just counter-extremist groups.
He was, but what he was also very good at was anybody such as... See, I believe that whilst people like yourself, you must have a voice, and you have to have a platform for that voice to be heard. People like me have a voice too. What we had with David Cameron was he wanted to shut down the voice of anybody like myself. The minute I say anything about Islam, I'm deemed the racist, I'm deemed the Islamophobe, I'm deemed the hater. And when people have been arrested purely for Facebook statuses, because people, see, I believe that I'm an atheist myself. I don't have a religion. I chose never to have a religion. I was never christened. I do not think that people have, I would never want to take away somebody's faith. If somebody finds comfort in faith or whatever it is they find from that faith, I've got absolutely no problem with it. When a faith is forced onto me in ways that I find totally unacceptable, then I'm offended by that. But what you see is this faux offendedness. So I get frustrated when, for example, the drawings of the Prophet Muhammad. Now, to me, this is just a bit of paper. You can choose to look at it, you can choose not to look at it. Nobody's forcing somebody to look at a cartoon, and it is just a cartoon. And the English and the Americans, we've laughed through adversity for most of it, especially the English. I mean, we are renowned for laughing in the face of adversity. It's just something we do very, very well. Now, the problem you've got then is that what we saw was 10,000 Muslims in London immoral outrage over a cartoon, but when 1,400 girls in Rotherham got raped and groomed and trafficked and tortured, and including then their tongues being nailed to tables and passed around uncles, brothers and cousins, there was no, you get a picture saying, well, look at these two Muslims, and I've been like, it's two. It's two. That is not 10,000. That was a piece of paper you could have ignored. These were human beings. These were lives that have wrecked beyond all recognition.
Well,
I don't like the double standards.
You're right. I don't disagree with that at all. I think that in our Muslim reform movement, again, we have in our declaration a sentence that says that we all signed. It says, ideas do not have rights, human beings have rights. So Islam is an idea. It's an ideology. It doesn't have any rights. That's why we reject the term Islamophobia. That Islamophobia term is a term generated by the Organization of Islamic Cooperation, 56 countries that, left to their own devices, will kill each other through tribal disgust. But right now, their program, the OIC, is a voting bloc in the UN. They divide the world into the land of Islam, Dar al-Islam, and Dar al-Harb, or the land of Islam and the land of war. So they always vote together against Western countries. The West doesn't call itself the OCC, the Organization of Christian Cooperation, because it's gone through that separation of church and state. And Islam needs to go through that time. And I think there was a Muslim that worked for the Charlie Hebdo, magazine that was killed as part of that attack, that terror attack in Paris. So there are Muslims. The problem is that are secular, but the problem is like you said, they are too silent. They aren't speaking up. In Bangladesh, for example, over the last 6 months, there's been a program of assassination weekly to every other week of secular Muslims, of atheists, of other bloggers who are systematically, this is a Muslim democracy, by the way. It's corrupt in many ways, but it's a struggling democracy in Bangladesh. And the United States and the West needs to go in and work with the Bangladeshis to protect these individuals, because the future of the global ISIS right now is radicalizing many in Bangladesh. And with the open season against the secular atheist bloggers that we've seen, if this continues, you're going to push reform into the Stone Ages again. We have to protect the reformers. We have to hold Saudi Arabia accountable. Raif Badawi has been in jail, has been flogged in front of mosques. He's a secular Muslim. I think he may have become an atheist. But the bottom line is that these are what test our community's tolerance and our ability to tolerate reform. And I would tell you, as a Muslim, we use, and I know this may be controversial, but we use the example of the Prophet. There are many hadith, discussions of the Prophet, that say the Prophet used to have atheists, pagans, and others come and have conversations and ridicule him. I don't remember valid hadith saying he would kill them, stone them, or prevent them, or force them into conversions. So there may be other stories, but the bottom line is that, call it mythology, call it whatever you want, the Muslims that can look at those stories and say that the Prophet, if he were alive today, would protect those of any belief or no belief, is the only Islam that can survive in a way that will not be in conflict with universal human rights. And that's what every president, every prime minister, parliamentarian, academician needs to do in the West, is to hold Muslims accountable to the Universal Declaration of Human Rights.
But what do you do when it comes to, for example, we have over 100 Sharia law councils, they call them councils, but they're courts operating in the UK right now. And that's not including the ones within the mosques. We have mosques being built at a rate of knots that's unimaginable in such a small island. You know, England is a very small place. And it is, if you look, if anybody looks at the map of the United Kingdom and then look at where most of the extremists and ISIS fighters that have gone out to fight for ISIS have come from, it's mainly from England. And when you look at the amount of people that have been targeted and raped and abused, it's mainly people in England. Now, that's not to say it doesn't affect all of the UK, but on the whole, it's hitting the England hardest. Now, you then have the added problem that, for example, Westminster has been bought using Sharia bonds. Now, because it's been bought using Sharia bonds, when they signed for the Sharia bonds, at the bottom of it, it said, I believe it said, praise be to Allah. It also states that this building, which is our Department for Work and Pensions, is governed by Islamic law. So surely that stands to reason then that our government now will be governed by Islamic law. And that's how far, and that's because Saudi Arabia has got such vast amounts of money within our country. They own the Shard, they own Canary Wharf, they own a lot of our banking systems. They've bought up Admiralty House, which is a historical house. There's masses and masses of Qatari money and Saudi money, whereas America, you tend to have more Iranian sort of deals going on. So how do we, people like myself and you, how do you and I work together to combat what's already in our country? How do we do that? How would you suggest that people do that?
Well, the problem, and you again hit the nail on the head, is that the leaders, the people influencing these bonds and Sharia finance, are the mafia, the Islamist mafia of the planet, which are these governments, the Saudi government, the Qatari family, the Iranian regime now that we've handed $150 billion to. So this concept that somehow regimes will change by opening up economics is completely absurd. 98% of terrorism against the West has been Sunni terrorism, not Shia terrorism from the Khomeinis. The reason is not because the Khomeinis are moderate. They are radical, anti-Western, anti-Semitic demagogues that hate the West and call us the devil. But the reason there's been minimal, not none, but Hezbollah hasn't been able to commit that many acts of terror is because of the economic sanctions against the Iranians. And the open economy with the Saudis building institutes of so-called interfaith dialogue in Belgium and elsewhere has been a laundering operation to allow them to bring in their theocracy and their Sharia courts and other things into the West and suffocate Muslim voices within Britain, within America, by them dominating us through media, through lobbyists. I mean, the Saudi money, last year, both the right and the left were exposed as taking millions of dollars, not just the Clinton Foundation, but Haley Barbour and other Republican lobby groups in Washington took millions from the Saudis. Haley Barbour took in $500,000, the former head of the Republican Party. His PR firm took $500,000 between the March 15 and March 2016. So this is a bipartisan problem, and that money brings with it a sense that, well, Muslims want Sharia finance, and many of us reformists have said, well, Sharia finance is a laundering operation that then allows them to determine where that money flows. They call it all about halal and other things related to what they view as religious things, but what it does, what they call no interest operations, are actually operations that are leased to buy scams, schemes, whatever you want to call them, that prevent money from going to individuals, especially Muslims, to have property rights and to be able to individually govern where our finances go. So it prevents actually free market issues, and that's why many of us are against it from an Islamic perspective. But this debate can't happen because we don't have the resources. I want to give you an example. I took a stand against this World Zakat Fund 7-8 years ago, and as a result, they sent me a threat of suit from London, saying that if I don't, and what we did was we exposed how the clerics on their Sharia finance to determine where that zakat money was going to go, that the clerics, we showed the radical things they had said about Israel, condoning terrorism and other aspects, which they wanted to suppress us from saying. Thankfully, I didn't have any property in London, so that it was really sort of, you know, they couldn't do anything with it. But the bottom line is that here's almost $1 billion fund called the World Zakat Fund that was threatening individuals like myself. So all I can tell you is that the strategy has to be where non-Muslims begin to help Muslim reformers and say, we are going to create, not, the UN is useless. We need to create a coalition of democracies, of free-thinking institutes that, just as in the Cold War, we developed think tanks that were counter-Soviet, anti-Soviet, anti-communist. But in the Cold War, we didn't work with the Italian communists, the Chinese communists against the Soviets. We said, wait a minute, they're drinking from the same trough of fascism, of communism. So similarly, right now, we have to stop working with Islamists that might be with us against Al-Qaeda or ISIS, but the bottom line is the Islamists of Saudi Arabia and Egypt are not any better, and they're not going to help us. They're going to suppress the real voices of pro-Americanism, pro-Westernism that is going to be the only avenue towards reform. And you're right, these courts, we have a movement in America called American Laws for American Courts. And we think that, yes, as much as I don't want government interfering in arbitration systems, those arbitration systems cannot be incubators for legal rulings that are against our principles in the West, be it the oppression of women, their inability to divorce, their inability to have inheritance, their inability to choose their dress or other things. These cannot be contained in Sharia courts, so they have to be monitored. Those Sharia courts have to be reviewed by public scrutiny in some way without violating their freedom.
Who would see? This is one of the problems that we have. We have something over here called the Muslim Council of Britain, who I happen to personally know are corrupt to the back teeth.
Absolutely.
Now, they're the very people that would step forward and go, well, let us be the ones to do to go in and make sure everything's running as it should be. But we know we can't trust them. So what we then have to ask is, who would go in and where Muslim women have come that I've been in touch with that have been victims of, for example, one lady who I've been friends with now for the last 3 years and supporting, and the only friend she's got is an atheist like me. Because within her own community, they're telling her that the shame of being a divorced woman, she should kill herself. That's the advice they're giving her. Now, she herself, she married out of love. She totally was in love with him. But she went through something, it was like a bit like a matchmaker. And this woman goes and checks him out and says, yes, he's a very nice young man. He's perfect for you. So they had the Sharia marriage in Pakistan, came back to the UK, got married under English law. For 3 years, he refused to consummate the marriage. He beat her. He would verbally abuse her. He would tell her she was ugly and unattractive. He would stamp on her feet when he walked past her. He would make her sit on the floor at his feet and eat her food on the floor like an animal. After 3 years of that abuse, plus he moved his family in, his mother, who was well aware of what had happened, he moved the mother in. And and her father were banished to their own rooms and not allowed in the rest of the house, even though it was actually her house. And after 3 years and taken her for £20,000, he goes to the local mosque. He gets the imam to perform the dalak, I divorce you 3 times on a piece of paper. She's served with that. He goes back to Pakistan. She's now still, in the eyes of our law, a married woman. She can't remarry and have a family, so she's been robbed of a family. And all of this goes on a regular basis in this country against Muslim women. So I don't see how Sharia courts or counsellors, when we have those things, we have marriage guidance counsellors in this country, I'm sure America has the same thing. We have all of those things. We have a UK law system, an English law system that works in this country. Women do need to be able to speak English, and they need to be able to learn English. Husbands are preventing them from learning English, because if they learn English, they'll learn their rights. If they learn their rights, they're going to stand up to their husbands. So how do we then break that pattern when Muslim women feel that the only person they've got that they can trust happens to be an atheist non-Muslim?
Well, I think, you are exposing the problem in that you are rare in your attention to the reality of the plight of women. And I think that it needs a civil rights movement. I mean, look at all the attention that the African American community got in the late 60s that finally exposed the plight of that community when the media and academics and others began to focus on the marches, the abuse and the racism that was endemic in Southern America. And I think similarly in the Muslim community, we need to have daily, this is why I have a podcast called Reform This. Every week I address, and just like your program, we address very, issues related to regular daily news that can show the chasm between the Islamist mindset of the 13th century and the Western mindset of universal human rights. So these courts should not be shut down. The mosques that are building throughout Britain I would tell you that, you know, France, for example, has shut down a number of mosques. Some of them should be. If they have weapons in them or they're preaching violence, those are not mosques. Those are embattlements that need to be shut down. But if they're preaching hate speech and no violence, the hate speech, as nauseating as it is, in America, our standard is simply imminent violence. And the reason the Supreme Court said that is neo-Nazi groups exist and a lot of hate groups exist, and we felt, and the court said, not only is that's how they determine the Constitution, but practically speaking, the best way to combat bad speech is with good speech. The best way to combat a existential threat is through public exposure and the antiseptic of sunlight. So all I can tell you is these Sharia courts, it might make us feel better to shut them down or somehow to make them not exist.
They're going to go underground. It's as simple as that. It's going to happen behind closed doors. It's going to be happening in somebody's house. So I do think we need to address them. But me personally, I would say you need to pick someone like me to go in there, as opposed to picking somebody from the Muslim Council of Britain.
And it doesn't have to be a Muslim. These are not about anybody getting into the Sharia law issues. It has to be, are they, for example, there are polygamous sects that have been shut down in America related to certain wings of a faith. They don't have to be, related to that faith community to say, oh, this is wrong and this is bad. It was simply incomprehensible that teenage women were undergoing polygamous marriages, and it was shut down because it was incompatible with our principles. Similarly, in Sharia courts, non-Muslims can say, this doesn't fit Universal Declaration. Call it Sharia, call it whatever you want. You can't do it in this country.
Well, I've just had a question sent to me, which is probably popped up on your screen too, because Graham would like to know. Now, I can understand why Graham's asking this question, the word taqiyya. He said the word taqiyya worries him. And I think it worries, this is a part of the problem that we've seen, is obviously, as I said, a lot of the working class people, that our government never expected for 1 second that the working class people would actually start to educate themselves. And when you start to educate yourself and you start to learn about the fact that the word taqiyya even exists, which is the right to lie to further the cause of Islam, then that's a concern also for non-Muslims, because what I'm trying to get across to, it's like I said to Rahil, I want to understand where people like you are coming from and how can I best help somebody like yourself, somebody like Rahil. How do we best bring us all together and work as one unit? As I said to somebody today, unity isn't about, them and us and taking up arms on our side. It's about taking people who want reform and working with them and saying, well, yeah, okay, that idea works, but I have to put this to you. And then you work it out together, and somewhere in the middle you come to something that you can all stand together, and that's when you've got true unity. But if you've got these words like taqiyya, which is the right to lie, how can the general public, especially in England, because as I say, we have been hit so hard with extremism. We have had so many girls now, over 40 towns in England have been hit by Muslim grooming gangs. And we've seen nothing but silence from the Muslim community, apart from the odd imam. Our imams that we've got in these mosques are being imported from Pakistan, Iran and Saudi Arabia. The only British imam I'm aware of is Taj Hagi, who set light to a burqa. Fair play to him, I say. But most of those that come into the country to preach in the mosque are coming from extreme countries. So with taqiyya, how do we address that? Mm-hmm. How would you advise, in your opinion, that non-Muslims start to work with people like yourself and build trust? How can they tell somebody who's lying and who's actually an extremist and somebody who really is a reformist? How can we tell?
Well, I think, that's a great question, because, at the end of the day, that's why I do this work. I want a public track record. Now, I've been doing this even before 9/11. As I mentioned, since the 80s in college, I was writing against the anti-Semitism of many Palestinian groups, against, the insidious insurgency of Muslim jihad groups, not violent jihad, but the civilizational jihadist groups. So I have a track record. For anyone who thinks I might be lying, they can look at what I've said. And taqiyya, what is taqiyya? Taqiyya actually arose from the Shiite community, who were extraordinarily persecuted initially after the Prophet died. There was a schism that happened. the Shia, in order to prevent persecution, pretended to be Sunni when they were actually Shia internally. So the bottom line is that's the origin of the word taqiyya. Bottom line is that I was raised, there's nothing in the Quran about taqiyya. The only thing that even comes close is a simple sentence in the Quran that says God would never want our life to come to an immediate end because of something out of our mouth. Meaning that if somebody was going to kill you because you were Muslim, you don't have to declare that. And I think, and that is an extreme thing, meaning that it's not something you can invoke all the time the way the corrupt Islamists do. It's if somebody's crazy, comes into your house who's psychotic and says, "Are you Muslim?" Would you have to be, declare that you are? Not true. Bottom line is that's not condoning lying. Taqiyya is another word for lying. And just like in our politicians, we see some politicians that pander, that say some things to some group, and we know they're saying different things a month ago, 6 months ago. I think Muslims don't have a monopoly on pandering. So taqiyya is sort of theological pandering, and you should hold us accountable. If you see Muslims telling you one thing publicly and in the mosque saying something different, this is why all the sermons should be publicized. They should be, we tape sermons, we tape debates and publicize it, because I tell my kids the same thing on the dinner table about America and about what we're doing here, about why we're here, the beauty of our country and freedom, as I do on television and on media interviews, etc. So there has to be a consistency there. But the only way to defeat the concept of taqiyya, or dissimulation, which is really what the Islamists do, they insinuate themselves in a false veneer of cooperation, when in fact, if they became a majority, just like Erdogan of Turkey, he said democracy is a train. You get on it until you get where you need to go, and then you get off. That is a corrupt fascist description of democracy. And we as Muslims need to stand against that and say that that's not what our faith is, that's not the humanity that we believe in, and begin to marginalize the theocrats who actually are corrupt to the core. So I would tell you, it was my upbringing that made me reject taqiyya. It was an Islam that was moral and honest and had humility and integrity that makes me reject any concept of taqiyya as lying.
But you can kind of see where non-Muslims are sort of going, nah, can't trust it. I mean, it's a bit like...
Yeah.
A lot of people are not Trump supporters. I do gather, though, from a little bit of information, you're a bit of a Margaret Thatcher fan.
Oh, absolutely.
Well, I will tell you now, I share Margaret Thatcher's birthday, so you'll be pleased to hear that.
Excellent.
So I must be Iron Lady Mark II, is all I can say.
But you're not combining, you're not mixing Margaret Thatcher with Donald Trump, I hope.
No.
Oh,
no,
thank you.
Not at all. I think Margaret Thatcher, while she didn't get it always right, she didn't. Let me tell you now, England and the UK will tell you that. The one thing I loved about Margaret Thatcher is when she made a decision, she stood by it and she followed it through to the end. And if you tried to push her, it was the worst thing you could do. Back her into a corner. She was going to turn around and say, well, I warned you. You were told. You didn't listen. The unions did it with the mining, they pushed and pushed and pushed, and she kept saying, don't push me, I'll shut the mines. They pushed her, she shut the mines. Now, I'm not saying it was good for the public, but what she was saying is, I'm the Prime Minister of this country. What I say goes. I make the rules, and you're going to follow them until I'm no longer Prime Minister. And I kind of have to admire that, but I do quite admire ballsy women that have courage, if I'm honest. Probably because I've got a set of myself, and most men quake as I go past, which is understandable. But I do think that people like yourself, I've come across you a few times. I know that other people have watched a lot of your videos, but there is this undercurrent in this country. I don't know how bad it is in America just yet, that there's this undercurrent in this country of complete and utter lack of trust for any Muslim.
Well,
and
I think that...
understand it, but it's not helpful.
And listen, I'm doing this, I don't blame many people for not trusting Muslims, because we are either silent or they're part of the Islamist corruption. And on the one hand, even when we have an Olympian that is wearing a hijab, she complains about her victimization in America, she complains about Israel, but yet she doesn't criticize the Assad regime for killing 500,000. She doesn't criticize the Saudis for what they're doing to women, the Iranians, and she doesn't, at least stop talking politics. So it becomes the issue that it's a sense that, if you're Muslim and you're going to represent the West as part of our faith community and part of our nation states, then you need to have the bandwidth of our speech be about how much we love this country and how much we want to see Muslim nations come to terms with the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And, I see some of the questions that were written here, talk about Saudi Arabia's funding, for example, of the ISIS movement. The founding fathers of ISIS are the Saudi Wahhabis. There have been more people beheaded in Saudi Arabia in the last 6 months than by the militants of ISIS. And the bottom line, it's the exact same legal system. So the only reason ISIS has flourished is not only Assad, who has allowed them to flourish, and Iran, but Saudi Arabia, and the fact that we in the West have not been involved in trying to initially help the third pathway in the Middle East, which in Syria would have been a more liberal movement. And yes, now it's been radicalized, etc., but there's no doubt that the Saudis have a mission, which is to destroy the West, to try to spread Islamic State movements, and they claim to be our allies. I wrote a piece in the National Review in December called Fighting for Victory, a blueprint for victory of the West versus the Islamic regimes. And I said, until we start to call today's evil empire, the Organization of Islamic Cooperation, which includes Iran, Saudi Arabia, Egypt, so many of these so-called allies of ours are feeding our enemies. And we need to cut off our addiction to oil. We need to stop the economic cooperation that allows, rather than regime change, regime development. And I can tell you, you can't reform Islam until those regimes change. And yes, it might get messier first, like in Iran, after the Shah left. It's been a mess now for over 30 years. But once this regime changes, I guarantee you it will not revert back to theocracy for a long time if they have a real democracy. In Egypt, the Brotherhood, 1 year of the Brotherhood running government did more to destroy the Islamist movement than 60 years of Nasser, Sadat, and Mubarak. So in many ways, letting democracy sort of organically fail and succeed and then fail, just like the French Revolution went through 9 iterations or however many iterations in their history, these revolutions need to go through their iterations rather than us siding with certain dictators that then fossilize any method of reform.
We do have another problem. Again, I can't speak for America. I mean, at some point, I'm hoping to get out to America to be able to explain to them how it feels as a non-Muslim targeted. I mean, I get death threats, rape threats, sodomy threats, you name it. I get every kind of threat that's imaginable. And our police, their attitude is, well, come off social media. Well, no, find out who it is and arrest their backsides. And I've had threats as far as come from as far as Germany, where I was given a complete essay described of exactly what they were going to do and how I would be subjugated by brown men, which I'm sitting there thinking, well, why would you even... He actually gave me a choice. You can be subjugated by white men or you can be subjugated by brown men. Oh, well, how about I'm a woman that won't be subjugated by any man? How about that? But what we have in this country right now, and which is another major problem for me, we have polygamy. Now, in my country, you have more than one wife. It's called bigamy, and men go to prison for it, and women go to prison for it. But because they say, oh, well, it's cultural. Now, this is where I feel that you can't always accommodate cultures. The culture of your country should supersede any other incoming culture from any other country. Would you agree or disagree? And how do we combat? Because what they're also doing is he'll take his first wife. He'll then take his second wife. Now, his second wife won't take his last name. She'll keep her name because she's Sharia wife. He then gets a mortgage on a house and he moves the second wife into that house with her children. But she claims single parent benefit, housing benefit, And taxpayers are basically paying for that property and buying his property for him. He then does the same with the third wife, the fourth wife, and so on. So if you can imagine, there's a lot of extremists in this country that are doing this. That's, to me, this is what they see as their form of jizya. They are getting their money out of the taxpayer one way or another. And in the process, buying half the property of this country, especially in the England area, in and around places like Luton. And I live in Bedfordshire myself, so I'm not that far from Luton. There are no-go areas. We do have them. People will keep saying they don't exist. They do. There are places, they haven't got a big sign up, and it doesn't say Sharia only, but there are places it is not safe for me to go. And I would be targeted and attacked. I know, because I stood for election as Police and Crime Commissioner in Luton, so I know how bad that is. Tower Hamlets, very much the same. Lufterahmen was exposed. We kept saying there was voting fraud going on, only now, and yet he still walked free. We've had men that have raped little girls as young as 11, and he walked free because his wife couldn't speak English. That's how corrupt our government, our police, and everything has become now.
Well, I have to tell you, the phrase that I've used repeatedly, and many of us reformers I've heard, Majid Nawaz and Osama Hassan and others use it also, it's this concept of a bigotry of low expectations, meaning that, oh, well, if they're Muslims here, we'll let them beat their wives, we'll let them... There's a case in New Jersey where a Muslim man raped his wife, and he used religious defense in the court. The judge rejected it, and on appeal, the judge was reversed because it was felt somehow that restricted their religious freedom, which I just get nauseated even thinking about. I mean, forced intimacy or relations in a marital relationship is not part of universal human rights. I don't care which country you're in, let alone if you're in America.
I think it was I believe it was 1994. You might need to double check that. We actually brought in law where you could then be tried for raping your wife. You know, we actually brought that into law because at one point there was a time in this country when you could not be arrested for raping your wife, which meant your wife couldn't say no. But then I've been looking at things like, for example, the reliance of the traveller. And there's a part in the reliance of the traveller that says that a wife cannot refuse her husband sex unless she is on her period, unless, of course, he thinks she's a liar. Now, if he thinks she's lying about it, she still can't say no. So if he says, well, yeah, I'm not so sure I believe you, she still can't say no. These are things that, as a woman, and I know in America you've got a major problem with the feminazis. I don't call them feminists because they're not. They are feminazis. We have the same here. They don't represent what I believe is true feminism. I believe I'm the epitome of true feminism, as is Baroness Cox. A massive respect for her and everything she's trying to do. And yet she's often tagged as being the most notorious Islamophobe known. Such is the hatred towards any woman who will stand up and call out Sharia, or will stand out and call a misogynistic behaviour of Muslim men. But I think you are right, and I think that you probably share a similar view. I'm not as eloquent as yourself. You're far more eloquent than I am. I'm very down to earth, I'm very much a salt of the earth kind of girl. But I do think that people like yourself and myself, we are, in truth, the answer if the government would just shut up long enough to listen to us.
Yeah, the government, I think, needs to stand by its constitutional principles, its principles of law that have been the bedrock of our civilization in the West, and defend them, and not allow insurgencies of groups to come in. Because I'll tell you, in Syria and Saudi Arabia, if people think that Muslims there, Muslim women, love wearing the burqa and the niqab, or the Muslim women there love not driving, love not working, love being raped, that is just absurd. That is a bigotry in and of itself. They don't. They want to see themselves have individual rights, and I can tell you that that there was a Nobel Prize of Economics given to Muhammad Yunus, who was giving microloans to women in Bangladesh and Pakistan, because once those women had economic independence, like you mentioned earlier, they no longer had to take orders from their husband, their brothers, or their uncles. And then they were allowed to interpret their Quran in a way that was moderate, that was equal between men and women, that gave them financial independence, and they rejected the interpretations, the misogynistic interpretations. So it's not about being Muslim. It's about, you mentioned the reliance of the traveler. That is the legal text of Shafi'i Islam. Shafi'i is the Islamic legal scholar of the 10th, 11th century, and that book is right now mainstream as far as most mosques. And you tell Muslims about, well, it calls for the killing of apostates, it calls for the end of blasphemy, etc. Bottom line is if they say we're lying, then what textbook do they use? Most of the reformist scholars, be it Mustafa Akil from Turkey, Abdullah Naim from Emory, all these scholars that influence Muslims like me, they've not developed a new 21st century school of law. It is stuck in the 12th century. And we need a new school of law that, just like in other faiths that have reformed, canonic law has either come to accommodate with Western common law, or it is no longer influential. So Islamic law needs to do the same thing, but for anyone who rejects or is in denial that they are not, as you mentioned, the texts still say women don't have rights, they don't have bodily autonomy, etc., and it is an apologetic to unbelievable proportions for Muslims to deny that fact.
And that's why people like yourself and people like Raheel, I know that my hour with you is up, and it's gone so quickly. It has, I have to say. But I do find you fascinating to talk to, and I have to say, big beaming smile. You people can't see it, but he's got a very nice smile as well, which is always a helpful thing. When you talk to somebody, the face says it all, which is another reason I detest the burqa, because to me, you've closed yourself off to me immediately. But I do think we need to keep giving voices to people like yourself, people like Raheel, Shireen, and vice versa. People like myself, we need to be given a voice too, and we need to start getting people to understand that actually, that yes, there are many Muslims being targeted, but there are many non-Muslims being targeted too.
Yeah, I served 11 years in the military, and the head of, I was the medical officer, a Muslim. My CO was Catholic, my XO was Protestant, the head of DEC was Jewish, the supply officer was Mormon. We used to get together and have interfaith conversations about the differences, but yet we would have each died for one another to protect our country, to protect our Constitution and freedom. That is, I think, the metaphor that Muslims need to embrace, that we can't say that, well, if we're a majority, then we'd have an Islamic State, but here we just follow the laws of the land. That's a schizophrenia. That creates the taqiyya, the lying that somehow, well, we have different rules if we were a majority versus the rules in the countries that give us the freedom that we can't get anywhere else. So we need to create relationships like now you and I have, and I think we can't do this on our own. You might, non-Muslims can get this in a half an hour talk. They all of a sudden understand it. Muslim communities that are coming from dictatorships that are corrupt, without free markets, etc., their educational systems are broken. They've not read Locke and Jefferson and Madison and Rousseau and Voltaire. They've not read those. They need to. It's going to take a lot longer process of modernization.
A lot of them have read Mein Kampf, though, which is slightly worrying as well.
Thanks to Assad and Khomeini and other and the king of Saudi Arabia, they brainwashed them about the West, and we need to fight that.
And I do think that they've got to, people of Muslims, reformists, Muslims who are trying to really make a difference. We also, as non-Muslims, people have got to stop beating us over the brow for our history, because it's called history for a reason. You can't keep punishing me for something that happened 100 years ago, 200 years ago, that I can't change. But let's not see Muslims like yourself dragged back to the 7th century when you're trying so hard to drag Islam into the 21st century. That's how it looks to me from the outside looking in. That's how it feels for me.
Amen. I couldn't agree more. So thank you. Thanks for having me.
No, it's been a real pleasure. I've loved every minute. It's gone so quickly. Thank you so much for giving me your time. I really do appreciate it.
Anytime. All the best. Appreciate it.
You take care of yourself.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye-bye.